Hello everyone and welcome to the American Civil War Gaming Club's YouTube channel. This is a series of videos dealing with the meeting Engagement at Resaca, which is a double-blind custom multiplayer game of 106 turns being fought utilizing WDS's Campaign Atlanta. This is part 3 in that series, and if you would like to check out Campaign Atlanta for yourself, you can visit the WDS website listed down in the video description below. Now let's do a quick recap of the previous turns. Luckily, that will not take long. We are only a handful of turns into this game so far. You can see the two forces moving towards one another here in northwest Georgia. Now what to watch for here in part 3? Well, first off, what is going to happen at Doug Gap? The Federals had planned to bypass it and move south through Snake Creek Gap if at all possible. But with a growing Confederate presence in Doug Gap, I don't know if that's still going to be able to happen. Up in the north, is the battle going to break out in Mill Creek Gap? McPherson is moving his corps quickly towards that area, and Claiborne's corps is there waiting for them, building breastworks. Well, let's just get right to it and move from turn number 5 to turn number 6 in the game, which is 6:20 a.m. And I believe the first thing we have to look at is right here with Doug Gap and Thomas's corps. Thomas is now fully dividing his corps, with half of it moving against Doug Gap to confront the Confederates moving into that area, and the other half of his corps is moving south through Snake Creek Gap, as originally ordered. Now, when you're trying to do two different things at once, it often doesn't end well for you. It's going to be interesting to see what Thomas decides to do here over the next few hours. Up in the north, you can see McPherson is concentrating his corps, preparing to move through Mill Creek Gap. Because of everything going on with Thomas's men, the Federals opted to use the first of their 5 meetings in this game. Each side here in this multiplayer battle gets 5 meetings per day. So for the Federals, this is their first. It is taking place between Sherman and Thomas. Sherman begins the conversation by saying that, "I don't want to bring on a serious fight at Doug Gap. Our goal is to keep Hood's corps tied down in Doug Gap, while McPherson and Howard drive into Mill Creek Gap to the north. Pin the enemy in Doug Gap and keep moving south with the bulk of your corps." But Thomas disagrees with this. "It is my belief that the battle is here at Doug Gap. We have a numerical superiority, but I fear that we are marching that superiority away from the battle. I request to use my whole force at Doug Gap to dislodge the enemy there." With the Confederates acting aggressive in Doug Gap, Thomas doesn't want to leave a large enemy force on his flank and rear, and that is perfectly understandable. After some back and forth with General Sherman, Sherman eventually tells him to proceed and to concentrate his full force against Doug Gap. Now let me give you some quick commentary about the decision and why it was made. Let's zoom in on the map here to where Rocky Face Ridge and Snake Creek Gap and Doug Gap are on the map. Thomas is moving against Doug Gap now with just under 23,000 men. Defending this area is Hood's corps with just over 14,000. Now the original plan for Thomas was to move some men against Doug Gap to amuse the Confederates, while moving the bulk of his corps south through Snake Creek Gap. But with so much pressure coming from Doug Gap and Stevenson's division, that has changed everything. The Federals are now going to move all of Thomas's corps against Doug Gap. And I would actually say that this is the right move to make. And it probably should have been the plan all along to put maximum pressure against Doug Gap. Now, of course, Thomas and the Federals, they have no idea that there's a whole nother Confederate division down here in Snake Creek Gap. That's going to be an interesting surprise for them in another turn or two. But with Thomas putting all this pressure against Doug Gap, it's going to force the Confederates to react to the sudden change. The Confederates were counting on the Federals moving south through Snake Creek Gap. Suddenly, that's not happening, and they're going to have to change their plans. Stevenson's division is the only force within Doug Gap, and he has about 7,200 men. That means he's going to be outnumbered more than 3 to 1 in that area. That being the case, what will Hyman do with his division of 7,000 men to the south? Will he continue to move into Snake Creek Gap and against Thomas's flank and rear? Or will he try to backtrack, move around on the eastern side of Rocky Face Ridge, and get in behind Stevenson to support him that way? It's going to be interesting to watch. Overall, Dug Gap is critically important for the rebels. And when you shift this map to the north, it very quickly becomes evident why that is. Here you can see Dug Gap along with Mill Creek Gap a few miles to the north, along with the town of Dalton there to the east. Dug Gap really is the key to the northern part of the battlefield. If Thomas is able to take Dug Gap, he will be behind Cleburne's corps at Mill Creek Gap and also be on the direct road towards Dalton. With McPherson already putting pressure against Cleburne in the north, that could put the Confederate corps in a very bad position. So if Dug Gap falls, Cleburne's corps will very quickly have to move south, back towards the rest of the Confederate army and the town of Resaca. Once the Federals take Dalton, the real battle can begin. But first, they need to get over Rocky Face Ridge, and then concentrate to the east of it. Everything the Federals do right now should be done with that in mind. Take the town of Dalton, concentrate their army, and then drive south. Moving now to turn number 7 in the game, 6:40 a.m. And you can already see that Thomas has reversed course and is now putting all of his corps up against Dug Gap. But he better watch out, because his southern flank is now open, and if Hyman does drive north, which it appears he is going to, he could cause a lot of damage against Thomas's right flank or his rear. Now, all these different changes with Thomas's behavior have prompted the Confederates to call a very quick meeting between General Johnston and General Cleburne. Already the ramifications of Thomas's moves are going to be felt. Johnston began the conversation by saying that, "I believe 2 whole corps are now moving on Dug Gap, and they have reversed course down the Snake Creek Gap. I believe Hyman will be aggressive and move north up Snake Creek Gap to relieve the pressure on Stevenson." But the situation remains critical as Stevenson cannot hold for long. Once he is dislodged, your position is no longer tenable. We must move your corps south and hold Dug Gap long enough for the army to reposition southward to stay between the Yankees and Resaca. Cleburne then responded by saying that he proposed to move Granbury's division southward to come in on Stevenson's right flank. With Hyman and Granbury aiding Stevenson, we should be able to hold them back and conduct an orderly withdrawal. I don't believe we could have held Mill Creek Gap for long anyways, so falling back from there is no great loss. Now, Cleburne's corps, they hold this area here, of course. Now, he is going to fall back with his corps. Granbury is going to try to reinforce Stevenson's division in Dug Gap and hold the Federals back in Mill Creek Gap. Meanwhile, Walker's division, just over there to the east, they are also going to try to slow the Federal advance in Mill Creek Gap to help buy time for Hood to retreat. So Cleburne's going to do everything he can to both help Hood in Dug Gap and hold back McPherson as long as possible. Now, my quick commentary on the Confederate decisions. The rebels are effectively giving up Mill Creek Gap. That's probably a smart move to make as McPherson was already outflanked in that position. But the decision to try to hold back McPherson as long as possible with part of Cleburne's corps, while simultaneously sending help to Stevenson, that kind of has me a little bit confused. What exactly is the end goal here? Is it to fall back towards Resaca and regroup? Is it to continue to fight over every hex on the battlefield? What exactly are the Confederates trying to do? Honestly, I'm not too sure. But this is a very experienced Confederate force, and if they feel like they want to fight over every hex, then that's what they're going to do. So we're going to have to wait and see how all this plays out. Moving to turn number 8 in the game, 7 a.m. And I'm going to add a column here for artillery losses, as the rebels have lost their first gun in this battle. And let's actually zoom in on this part of the map here around Dug Gap. As I said before, Thomas is moving against it with his whole corps of just under 23,000 men, and it is being defended by Stevenson with 7,400. Stevenson's division is giving ground, because they cannot afford to be outflanked here by this much larger federal force. Stevenson has excellent ground around Dug Gap, and it's been very easy for him to defend this ground even against the larger federal numbers. But the longer the battle goes on here, the harder it's going to be for Stevenson to hold this position. Thomas is moving as fast as he can, but the terrain really, even more than the Confederates, is slowing him down. Here to the south, Hyman is beginning to pivot his division northward through Snake Creek Gap. And Thomas has finally spotted the Confederates south of his position. It's going to be very interesting to see what he does next, now that he realizes there are more Confederates on the way. In the north, with Cleburne's corps already starting to fall back to the south, McPherson is wasting no time moving through Mill Creek Gap. And that's a very smart move by McPherson. Once you see the Confederates are falling back, go ahead and begin the pursuit. Turn number 9. And nearly all of Hyman's division now has been spotted by Thomas's corps just to the north at Dug Gap. Thomas has detached a brigade to the south, but he is continuing also to press against Dug Gap, despite the appearance of Hyman's brigades. Thomas is undoubtedly concerned, but he's hoping with just a little bit more pressure, he can break through Stevenson's division. Meanwhile, in the north, McPherson now fully controls Mill Creek Gap and is on the other side of the Rocky Face Ridge. Taking Mill Creek Gap without heavy losses is a major victory for the Federals. And Thomas's pressure against Dug Gap made all of that possible. Far to the south, Stuart is dividing his corps as they head north. Stuart can see the situation in the north, and he realizes Cleburne might end up in some trouble down the road. So it looks like he's going to send a division over in his direction, just in case they are needed. The other division appears to be heading north still towards Snake Creek Gap. Turn number 10 in the game, and Thomas is making progress against Dug Gap, but the Confederates are starting to get some help. Govan's brigade from Granbury's division has now reached Dug Gap, and they will soon be able to reinforce Stevenson's forces directly. And additionally, the rest of Granbury's division is also moving south along Rocky Face Ridge. But it is taking them an awful long time to cover that ground, as they don't have any trails or roads to utilize up along the top of the ridge. Meanwhile, Walker's division, minus the brigade which was sent south, is shifting to the west. The reason they're doing that is because this road here is completely clear. McPherson does not realize that there is a large gap in the Confederate lines because the terrain is just so chopped up and hilly. But the Confederates know that gap is there, and Walker's trying to move to prevent that road being used by the Federals. Turn number 11, 8 a.m. in the game. Thomas is now falling back from Dug Gap as he sees Confederate reinforcements reaching that area both from the east and from the south. With all this added pressure against his forces, he's making the correct call here. He's going to fall back and regroup. But having forced the rebels to open up Mill Creek Gap in the north, Thomas has already achieved a major objective in this game. Had he not put all that pressure against Dug Gap, it's likely the Confederates would not have abandoned Mill Creek Gap so easily. And as I said, falling back now is a smart move. It minimizes the risks to his corps if the Confederates decide to be aggressive and attack his force. But will the Confederates come off the high ground at Dug Gap to attack Thomas, with McPherson moving against their rear areas? That's going to be an interesting thing to watch as we progress. Moving to turn number 12 in the game, and the rebels are moving quickly on Thomas from the south with Hyman's division. Thomas is going to need to fall back faster or get really creative here to try to buy some time for his corps to regroup. He needs to build a new line, and he needs to do it quickly. Meanwhile, Cleburne is doing everything that he can to try to slow down McPherson and protect the rear of Dug Gap. turn number 13, 8:40 a.m. And let's actually take a better look at this area here with Cleburne's Corps and McPherson. Here we have Dalton, along with Rocky Face Ridge and the road to Dug Gap. Cleburne's Corps has just over 11,000 men, with 3 of Granbury's brigades along Rocky Face Ridge and 3 of Walker's brigades over northwest of Dalton. For the Federals, they have McPherson's Corps with 18,600 men and 3 divisions. And that road south towards Dug Gap actually still remains clear. And that is a major problem for the Confederates. But Cleburne is doing something smart here. Although he is currently out of position and can't directly defend that road, he is defending it by hitting both flanks of the road and making any Federal force moving along that road very, very uncomfortable. McPherson has a very tough road to travel here south along that road, with Confederates on the high ground on one side and also on the other side within the woods and some high ground there with artillery support. But McPherson does have help moving his way from Howard's Corps, which is now beginning to arrive on the map. Once Howard's forces reach McPherson, he should have an overwhelming force, and he should be able to push Cleburne back and take the town of Dalton. And this actually seems like a good place to take a break. So moving forward here in the next episode, there are a number of things that we're going to want to watch out for, and we're going to want to see how they play out. For instance, will Cleburne be able to conduct a fighting retreat once the Union numbers really begin to stack up against him in the north? Also, can Thomas keep Hood occupied so McPherson can hit Cleburne's reduced corps? Once Thomas relinquishes the pressure against Dug Gap, does that then free up men to reinforce Cleburne? Not only that, but will Thomas be able to reconcentrate his corps and fight off any Confederate attacks from the south with Hyman's division? Lastly, where will Stuart's corps end up heading? He has one division moving towards Snake Creek Gap and another towards Resaca. Is that still going to be the plan? And how aggressive will Stuart be here in this battle? Is he going to build breastworks at Resaca for the army to fall back and utilize? Or is he going to march north towards the sound of the fighting and throw his forces into the battle? Well, we're going to find out in the next episode. And if you enjoy all these videos and you enjoy Civil War gaming, well then come check us out at the American Civil War Gaming Club. Our website is ACWGC.net. There are hundreds of members in our club, and we are always gaming utilizing the WDS American Civil War series. Until next time, everybody, just remember, keep gaming.